She is a writer and women's basketball analyst. We now welcome Rachel Galligan onto Hoopsology. How's it going?
I'm good. I'm good. Happy to be here. Excited to be here chatting hoops with you guys as we're entering into draft week. I had to represent with my hat a little bit, but yeah, I'm doing great. Happy to be here.
Thanks for being on the show. Really appreciate it. Rachel, before we hop into the WNBA draft, there's been some late breaking news in regards to the Minnesota Lynx. With Alex Rodriguez and Mark Lore finalizing a deal to buy not only the Lynx but the Timberwolves also. What are your initial thoughts on this? Do you think is there any kind of effect this will have on the WNBA? What was your initial impressions on hearing this news?
I'm gonna be honest. It's not something that I've really read a ton about. I think I saw it yesterday, Saturday, for the first time, and it was kind of a little bit of a similar reaction to when I found out about the Aces being sold. I felt like, I think that's positive news. I'm excited to see what comes from it. I know it does include the Lynx, and I think that shows a ton of value. I mean, anyone who follows the WNBA knows that the Minnesota Lynx is a powerhouse of a franchise in itself. So I take it as a positive. I'm anxious to learn more about it. Can't really speak a ton on it right now, but I think for me, my initial reaction was this is a good thing.
Gotcha. Let's hop into the WNBA draft, and I think I can speak for myself. I think the league has been at its hottest right now in terms of everything going on. What are you expecting in the WNBA draft, not only in the players selected, but also in coverage too? Because the scene on ESPN, it's run the gamut of just it being in ESPN's own television studios. I think they've done it through, one of the stores. It doesn't, I guess comparing it to the men's game, doesn't have that same fanfare, which I've had a personal beef with, just in terms of respecting, each league equally. So what are you expecting in terms of just the players being selected and kind of the draft coverage itself?
I think the coverage leading up to it's been as high as we've ever seen. I mean, I remember just kind of like, I'm with you. I mean, just the lack of coverage. I remember a really quick show. They would give them 20, 25 minutes on ESPN, boom, boom, boom. And it went like you blinked and it was over. And last year, the 2020 draft, obviously very different with it being during, COVID and everything. But I felt like there was a ton of hype around that, a ton of buildup leading into it. I think that momentum has only continued. And I think especially, I referenced the women's NCAA tournament a ton. I mean, the coverage that we saw that was really pushed this year, it was more than I can't remember a time when I would stay on and watch Sports Center and there was coverage immediately following the women's tournament. That was groundbreaking to me. So I think that momentum only naturally carries over when it comes to the WNBA, especially when it's such a short gap between the two. And I think we've seen more hype around this draft than we ever have. I'd be curious if anyone feels differently, but I've seen more mock drafts, version 4.0, version 8.0. I wrote one for the first time for an outlet that I was kind of covering. So I think that it's going to just continue to build. I feel really good about where it's at. I think obviously, are we satisfied? No. But I'm excited to kind of see what Thursday night's going to bring from a coverage standpoint. Obviously, it being virtually, we'll have to see. But hopefully, we get some really good in-depth analysis. Hopefully, we get some of the players joining in. But this draft in itself, I can't remember a time where it was this talked about.
Can you give us some things to look for in the draft, some key players and teams to look out for what they're going to do in the draft?
Well, first and foremost, Dallas having 4 of the top 12 picks or 4 of the first round picks is insane. So that's just fascinating to me. Just stockpiling picks at this point. I think a lot of us have questioned, man, are we going to see a trade? Maybe leading up to it, with it being less than a week away, you got to question, could there be some draft day trading that goes on? I think that's always a possibility. But who they decide to go with number one. The general consensus across the board has been about Charlie Collier out of Texas, and the junior decided to declare early, which wasn't a great surprise to anybody. But I think there's a lot of hype around her, but there's also some room for some debate. Could we see a surprise where someone else ends up going at number one? Or does Dallas just kind of stockpile those first 2 picks and kind of go Charlie Collier and a walk from Finland, which is kind of what everyone is feeling like could happen? We'll see. Or is there someone else, someone that hasn't really been talked about as the number one pick? I mean, Ari McDonald from Arizona, out of any player, in my opinion, her stock rose more than anybody during that NCAA tournament, what she was able to do as a leader for her Arizona team. And she's got to be, I mean, if she's not a lottery pick, she's got to be right on the outside of it at 4. So those would be, Charlie Collier. I'm a big international fan, so I think you throw in some elements that, the NCAA gave everybody an extra year or an option to have an extra year. So we actually don't have as many players declared for this draft as there normally would be. I think it's around 57. That number might have changed. So really, there's not as many players to pick from as years past, because some players did decide to stay their 5th year or that extra year. But there's also, in my opinion, as limited number of roster spots as there's ever been. So it's not a terrible decision. A lot of these players, many of even the first round picks, won't make a roster. So going to be really interesting, especially I think we look at those first 8 and what that order is. I personally love Awak Kure from Finland. She's super talented. I've watched her since she was very young. Just had her on our podcast last week, and very exciting future for her. She's just 19 years old. But those, Dana Evans from Louisville, phenomenal competitor, has really elevated her game and proven that, she can be a dominant force, a dominant scoring force. Aurelia Garantes from Rutgers, just a pure scorer. A lot of those teams, especially in the lottery section, just need some scoring. So those would be the names that I would focus on, at least in those top 5 or 6 picks.
Rachel, I want you to take us back to the WNBA bubble, and I think it was so revolutionary on many facets, including the coverage itself, because to me it was the first time, and Matt will attest to this because I've had many conversations with him that's about like really complaining about ESPN's coverage as a whole, but it was the first time I saw them actually put in times to longer form packages of the players, deeper analysis during the halftime shows, really respecting the league, I believe, for the first time. So can you just take us in just what you thought of overall, just covering the league itself during the WNBA bubble, what the players were going through, and now, even though it seems like the lights at the end of the tunnel regarding the pandemic, we're still not seeing fans at 100% capacity at a lot of sporting events. It's still going to be, a little bit strange until maybe 2022. So what was kind of your opinion in terms of what the players were going through inside the WNBA bubble, just in terms of the fear in regards to just this pandemic happening, not to mention the big social justice movement in which the WNBA players were in the forefront of for years.
For sure.
In sports, of course.
Yeah, I mean, last summer season, the 2020 season was what an emotionally charged season. What a challenging season of a lot of adversity, a lot of emotion, a lot of struggle. I have to really tip my hat to the women of the league for being such leaders, on the social justice front, and everything that these women are willing to put on the line to fight for equality and to fight for what is right. We're seeing a huge movement, in my opinion. Like the National Women's Soccer League has been phenomenal with it. The WNBA using their voices in a way that is just revolutionary, and I'm proud to really stand alongside a league that makes me proud to be a woman and makes me proud to be someone that's passionate about this game. And I think, and then you throw on top of that, like you're saying, the pandemic and this bubble. And I really have to compliment the league. Were things perfect? No. Were there a lot of complaints and things that were needed to be addressed early on? None of us knew what that was going to look like. And especially all of us on the outside looking in, we never stepped foot in that bubble. We don't know what that was like day in and day out. I think we continue to hear stories. Here we are, close to a year later, about how mentally challenging that was and how mentally taxing it was, from anyone involved with the team, from the players to the coaching staffs, just the monotony of it and not being able to feel a sense of normalcy in your life. Now, I'll take it a step further and say, yes, all of us were kind of feeling that in one way or another, right? Being kind of stuck at home and not being able to go do the things we want to do. But I think that the league, to kind of be the blueprint, to what a bubble could be, what that looked like. I think there were a lot of skeptics on if they could even be pulled off, if this was even safe. So I really have to tip my hat to the league. I want to obviously compliment the women who were there and who stuck it out and really just went to work every single day. I can't imagine what those challenges were. And I know in one half, you have to be happy that you're playing, but on the other front, you're probably having a lot of mental struggles of not being able to be a little more present and doing the things that, you would typically get to do. So I've really enjoyed hearing a lot of the stories and a lot of the thoughts after the fact. I think the common theme that I've heard from players and coaches has just been, man, it was very difficult, and we really don't know if we can do that again. Like to bubble again in that way would be probably far too much to ask, at least in back-to-back years. I don't think anybody wants to do that. I think that the league is really pushing to find a way to do this in a way where people can be at home in their beds and travel in a way that's, as safe for this league as possible. And that brings up the topic of equality of how the NBA travels versus how the WNBA travels. I mean, we could talk about that till the cows come home, but these women don't have the luxury, unless they're going to surprise us with some sort of news that they can fly private. But these women have to fly commercial just like the rest of us if they want to get from one city to another, and that poses a lot of concern. So still question marks on what this season looks like, but I really have to compliment and I'm really in awe of everybody who was able to pull that off last summer. I really was, and I think that it was very, very, what's the right word? Just powerful. It was powerful across the board to see how strong these women are, to go through that, to continue to put their head down, go to work every day, and continue to be that voice for change. It just made me extremely proud.
One of the things we saw in line with kind of the extra effort that went into that, and maybe the extra toll, you mentioned from like a mental fatigue standpoint, spiritual, emotional fatigue standpoint. But, one of the maybe silver linings that we saw was that we did see a ratings increase. That's something that Justin and I like to look at a lot. And I love your thoughts on that as far as, was the ratings increase, simply the depth of the league, which you mentioned, it is a very deep league with very few roster spots. Is it kind of a buildup of that coming to fruition? Are there other factors that maybe contributed to the ratings increasing? What were kind of your thoughts in seeing those ratings increase?
I think that's a really good question. I think it's really cool to analyze. I'd be curious your guys' thoughts on it too. But for me, I look at it because I cover both college and WNBA. I really feel like the women's NCAA tournament these last 4 or 5 years has just been phenomenal. I've heard from countless people that they've enjoyed it more than the men's, and that's kind of been the common theme. We think about some of these shots that we saw, the last few years, from Marike to Morgan Williams. Unbelievable moments that were just eye-catching to so many people. And I really think that the momentum of the college game, I'm not saying this is the whole reason, but I think there's been a ton of momentum from the women's college game, and the way that it's been covered on a national scale, especially the tournament, carries over to the WNBA. And I also think social media plays a huge role in it. We have seen so many influential names across both levels, and a lot of those, like Taya Cooper, huge following on social media. She has a huge presence. She is culturally bringing in so many new fans, right? And that's transcending not just what she was able to do in college, but now the WNBA. So I think you have the collegiate aspect of it. I think you have this kind of social media influencer aspect that a lot of these women have built for themselves, and that is kind of carrying over. But I also just think, for me, like when I was a little kid, we knew on Sunday that I'd get back from church and I'd have my lunch, and we knew that there was going to be some WNBA game on that afternoon. I knew it would be on ESPN, and there was kind of a consistency standpoint. I think we got away from that, and for whatever reason, finding games or understanding where you could even watch a WNBA game got really difficult. You really had to stay on top of that. Now, I think the last few years, the visibility is better. Is it where I want it to be? No. But you have a little more consistency with the WNBA League Pass, which is a great deal. It's like nothing to be able to have access to these games. Now you've got games that are able to be streamed on Twitter, which we haven't really seen a ton of before. And now I really think that, between ESPN and their broadcast partners, they're starting to show games a little more consistently. Before, I felt like it was so sporadic. It'd be like a random Monday night and no one knew when to watch it. And that was always the common theme that I would hear from young players or different sports fans that I would talk to. Like, I don't know where to watch this at. I think that's getting better. But I think the consistency aspect and just being able to have great games on the national scale, on ESPN, on ESPN2, on those flagship stations, the more we can have of that and the more consistency we can have, it's only going to get better. I think it's improved. I think this year it's only going to get even better.
Yeah, Rachel, I agree with you. And as I said earlier, my beef with ESPN with its coverage of the WNBA is just the little things in terms of just reading highlights in the way that they read a highlight compared to an NBA game. It's just not the same. And not only that, just analysis too. I mean, there's tons of analysis on a random NBA game, none for a WNBA game, not to mention the slate of debate shows not really even discussing the WNBA compared to other sports on our network in which they are talking about it. And to me, I'm a big fight fan. I'm a big UFC fan, but for a long time, UFC wasn't even on their network, and they're bashing it. And yet with the WNBA, here's something that's on their network for years and no mention of any coverage. So their coverage has been pretty baffling, in my humble opinion, and I'm glad with the bubble finally there was actually some change to that. And I want to highlight like Maria Taylor. I thought she did a really good job with her pieces too, inside the bubble. Yeah, for sure. So I think just hopefully that becomes a trend and not just an anomaly for this season. And I want to ask you, we have the date for the draft. You mentioned it's this Thursday, April 15th, depending on when you're listening or watching this. But there hasn't been a date for the announcement of the WNBA season yet. So I'm just wondering why is that the case? Is that unusual, or is there something? Is it should be taken as, hey, we should just be patient in terms of getting that release date?
I don't know if I should say this or not, but hell, why not give a little breaking news? No, I'm kidding. I know that the sources close to the matter, the schedule was going to come out a couple weeks ago, and there was issues. There were some things that I didn't feel like I have nothing to do with it, but you're dealing with how do we make this fair? How do we make this safe? And I think that there's been a lot of conversation and discussion on what does that look like? Now, we don't get to know because we're not in those rooms, right? And we don't really necessarily think about, well, what would it be like for, say you kept the games on certain coasts, and you weren't flying from New York to LA, and you're trying to do this kind of in a gridded, condensed manner before you start crossing the entire country and travel and things like that. So I think that there are some logistic pieces and some safety concerns because they're not bubbling, as it was last year, just trying to make this right, and they want to get it right. They want it to be fair to everybody as much as humanly possible from a logistics standpoint. So I think that that's kind of what this comes down to. If it were this were a normal year and we weren't in the middle of a pandemic, the schedule would already have been released. I think it's probably really close. But I think that we need to be, a little bit patient and, understanding as to what this league and the teams are trying to kind of work out together. And I can't imagine the challenges trying to build a schedule with the limitations this league requires, So I think it's going to come out really soon. And I think the only reason is it's been delayed is just trying to get it right, trying to get it fair, and trying to keep everybody, as happy as possible.
Yeah, I think it's just kind of frustrating in a way because we mentioned the kind of positive momentum that's been built in the bubble and everything, and it's kind of like when the NBA was releasing their schedule or whatever. It was just kind of like, this is happening in December. here we go. I'd like to, in some sense, the same, I guess, kind of like security or the same assuredness with the WNBA schedule as well. But obviously there's stuff I'm not privy to. I wanted to ask, given kind of on a more positive note, the positive momentum that we've seen, what are your thoughts on expansion in the league? Is that something you'd like to see in the future? And is that something where, is there a certain, I guess, kind of like benchmark in terms of rating, revenue, those types of things that you'd like to see happen that might meet the conditions for expansion? Or should we just focus on what we have now, which is a very deep, talented league?
God, it's hard, because
Big question, I know. Sorry.
you want it to happen. We all feel like there is a need for it, right? Like, we talk about 144 players when really it's not 144 players, because you're going to have teams like the Connecticut Sun who are going to have to play with 10 this year just based on their salary cap. So we talk about how difficult it is to make a team, right? And I think we are building up to it. There's no question in my mind. I don't know, it's so hard. You don't ever have any numbers. You don't know exactly what the league is making. You don't exactly know the pieces. It's all very unknown, right? We're all out here as media or fans trying to speculate, like, is this even feasible? Is it possible that we could have this right now? We all feel like it could, because we feel the momentum that is building up around this game, which is a wonderful thing. I think it will happen. I don't know if it's something that, is a year or two down the road, maybe something a little bit further out. But I mean, there are, I did a piece, and I know a lot of people have, about expansion markets and where would that be? What does that look like? I think that the two that really come to mind are the Bay Area, Oakland area, and Philadelphia. I mean, those two areas are hotbeds for basketball, especially Philly. I mean, you've got such a reach there, and there is such a market for the game, and there's a market for women, just grassroots women's basketball in general, that's so big there. So I think we've identified the top kind of areas that this would look really good in. I don't know when, I don't know how. I would like to believe that it's just a few years away. And I would love to see more players. I don't want to continue to go down a draft class where just, maybe the top 6 or 7 make a roster and everyone else is packing their bags to go overseas, and, best of luck competing over there, and showing that you're able to do this. So my frustration with that is just, there's not a ton of transparency in terms of what does this league actually generate, and how far away are we from that? I think, to me, it's a huge question mark. I don't know. I can only go off the momentum that I think all three of us feel, and it feels like we're inching closer to it. But I don't know. I mean, I'm curious your guys' thoughts on that.
I think Matt and I kind of have a vested interest in the expansion because we live in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So huge fan base for women's basketball. So I think I can speak for Matt. We had the Thunderbirds. I know Matt had season tickets for the G League and had a pretty decent following when they were here. So a WNBA team in Albuquerque, I think, would do very well. But it seems like the WNBA wants to tie into the new franchises with existing NBA franchises. And I'll confess, in terms of living here all my life, attracting just professional sports teams into New Mexico has not been our forte as a city and a state, to say the least. So I think certainly, even though if there were interest from the WNBA, I think from a local standpoint, we would struggle to really pull it off. I think it kind of takes two to tango. But to your point of expansion, yeah, I think the markets you have mentioned, I completely agree. Those are probably the two hotbeds. I guess my question for you would be, would they be interested in expanding in markets that are not tied to an NBA franchise? Because if that's the case, I think there's a lot of opportunity for growth there, specifically, in Matt and I's neck of the woods.
Yeah, I agree. And I don't think that's talked about enough. Or what are the markets that are not tied with an NBA franchise? Like New Mexico, that's a phenomenal point. I mean, I'm in Denver, and I've lived on this area of the country along with Arizona. I've seen the opportunity there is here out west for more professional sports just in general, because it's a little bit more difficult to get to them, right? We all can't just hop in the car and go drive 3 hours to Chicago and watch the Sky play. But where are those markets where it's not directly tied to the NBA team? Honestly, I think a Nashville would be a really cool one.
Yeah.
Tennessee has a long, rich history of basketball. I mean, Tennessee Lady Vols, for instance. I mean,
Summit, yeah.
I mean, that's the Women's Basketball Hall of Fame, and you have a really massive market that is booming there, just in general. Where I feel like a city like that could really wrap their arms around this league and really embrace them in a way that is something different. I don't think it has to be tied with an NBA franchise. Now, I mean, you have the facilities, you have the perks of being tied with an NBA team. But if there was someone who was willing to buy and invest in this and put this in a market where it could really just take off, I don't see why that's not possible at this point.
Rachel, I wanted to ask you specifically the upcoming season and Sabrina Ionescu. I remember the time watching that game of her debut and just seeing her just get hurt. It was so brutal. What do you expect overall from her, but also just the season as a whole, in terms of favorites, any players that stand out to you, any storylines that fans should watch out for, especially those who are maybe giving the WNBA a try for the first time whenever the season kicks off?
I'm excited for this season. I'm excited for it to feel a little more normal, with everybody being able to play at home, in front of their fans. We just unveiled these new jerseys, which has brought in a ton of hype. People love the gear. They love the jerseys. People want to invest in those and buy those and be a part of it. I think they did a phenomenal job with that. But this season, man, I mean, it's hard for me because there's so much movement, right? Like, I have to constantly remind myself, okay, she's now with them. They traded for this. So, I mean, it's going to look completely different. Not to mention, you throw on players who didn't even play last season because they took a medical opt-out because of the pandemic. I mean, Elena Deladon, the best player in the world, in my opinion, getting an opportunity to watch her back in D.C. Liz Cambage, the most dominant center in the world, being back with Las Vegas. We weren't able to see everybody compete last summer. And so now I'm looking forward to not only just a lot of the movement that's taken place, as we see a lot of these players in new uniforms, but just players that we didn't get a chance to see last year. I think the biggest one is the Chicago Sky. I mean, they were able to kill free agency. They were able to sign on Candace Parker in free agency. Anyone who has followed the league for a long time, she would be considered former MVP, really has been a cornerstone of the league, true legend of the league. And she is from Chicago, has spent her entire career in LA, now has returned to Chicago and will be in a Sky uniform. And I mean, the Chicago Sky are trending upward. James Wade has done a phenomenal job with this roster. You've got Courtney Vandersloot and Allie Quigley, and you've got Diamond DeShields, an exciting, kind of young athlete that is really still coming into her own. And then you throw on Candace Parker, and this roster is primed for a really intense run. I think they've got to be in conversation in top 3. The Las Vegas Aces, Asia Wilson, the returning MVP. I mean, she's just a straight bucket. Like, I love Asia. She's willing to throw the team on her back and just go to work and do what she needs to do. But then if you return Liz Cambage on with her, how does that dynamic look a little bit? They also signed Chelsea Gray, one of the top point guards in the league, who came over from LA. So Vegas, I think, is probably the favorites headed into the season. I mean, a lot would probably agree with me on that. I think you have a whole new genetic makeup of the Los Angeles Sparks. I mean, you had a roster that was really together for a long time, and in my opinion, it was a little stale. I love the changes. I love seeing Candace in Chicago. I love seeing Chelsea in Las Vegas. I think those are 2 great fits. And I love that Los Angeles now kind of gets to continue to build around, their MVP and Nneka Ogwumike, but also get younger, kind of turn over this roster a little bit, get a little bit of a fresher look. And you've got Erica Wheeler, who's coming back. She was MVP at the All-Star game a couple years ago, did not play last season. She's hungry. She's got a chip on her shoulder. She's going to bring a ton of energy to LA. I don't know that you put them in contention this year, but it's going to be a fresh new look, and that is exciting to me. I mean, I could go I could go down the board. I think the last one I would talk about would be New York. I mean, Sabrina Ionescu returning. She is just unbelievable. I mean, that's the type of player. It's one in a million. From a mentality standpoint, what she brings to the game and the eyes she's single-handedly brought to women's basketball. So it's definitely excited to see what she can do. But they signed the Nigel Laney, Natasha Howard. I mean, that's going to be a completely revamped New York roster as well. We're no longer talking about them as a bottom team in this league. Like, in my opinion, if they don't finish in the middle part, like, that's a failure. So a lot of new looks, a lot of changes. I think Minnesota's going to be extremely dominant. Cheryl Reeve has done a phenomenal job. You can't leave them out of the top conversation of contention just around Crystal Dangerfield, and they signed Kayla McBride from Las Vegas. But those would be the teams I think that they really got my attention, and I personally am excited to see LA versus Chicago. That matchup throughout the season will be fun. As Candace gets a chance to play against her own old team.
For sure. And I think we've seen Candace just be out there as just a media personality as well. Yeah. Her along with Shanae as well on ESPN. What do you think of just seeing the WNBA players on more media platforms to have their voices heard? I think that's something that I see an increase within this pandemic era, to seeing them on the forefront, and just with Candace and particularly on NBA and TNT, and just kind of being the counter for Shaq's just somewhat insane comments sometimes. There's Candace always there to kind of check them. So with seeing that kind of trend take place, do you think that will have a more of a positive reflection on the WNBA as a whole moving forward as well?
Sure. I mean, how could it not? I mean, Candace Parker is just really taken off. Same with Shanae. I mean, she's all. I mean, every time I turn on the TV, I see her, and I think it's phenomenal. I mean, what a great representative, both of them, of the women's game, and how intelligent they both are. The analysis that they bring. The perspective that they provide is incredible. I think you got to throw Renee Montgomery in there. Now she's retired, but what she's doing, and now as a part owner of the Atlanta Dream, but she's been really great in the media space and will continue to. I mean, I was listening to her cover some of the college games, the women's games, and just learning. I love learning from these players who've done it. They're continuing to do it, and they have this fresh new perspective that we haven't heard before. So I think it's really groundbreaking. I think you've got a really great core group of either players or former players who are just dominating the space right now. I hope we continue to see more of it.
Well, Rachel, thank you very much for coming on the show. Really appreciate it. Really enjoyed the chat. Can you please let our listeners and viewers know where they can find you on social media, and also what you're up to just in this coming year as well?
Yeah. I mean, I'm pretty active on Twitter, just at RachGal on Twitter. I like to kind of just put my thoughts out there and break my news out there. Right now, I'm working just solely with Winsider. You guys have maybe heard me on my podcast. Me and my co-host, R.A. Schwartz, love having players and coaches and GMs on, usually weekly. So make sure you check us out at Winsider. But honestly, the best place is on Twitter, just at RachGal.
Awesome, Rachel. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm sure this is not the last time we'll chop it up with you about the WNBA. As I'm looking forward to this season. I think Mac probably thinks the same. So thank you very much for coming on the show.
Of course. Have me anytime.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, thank you for that awesome analysis, too. Really appreciate it.